She had driven 2.5 hours from Portland to say a single sentence. The man at the fence didn't look up when the Range Rover stopped. He kept working, prying a warped board loose, checking the grain along its length, setting it aside. His flannel was gray with dust, his hands moved without hurry. She stepped out. Gravel shifted under her shoes. "My father said you'd know about it." He set the board down, turned, unhurried, like a man who had not been surprised by anything in years. Then he looked at her and said 4 words. She had no answer for them. He had come to Joseph on a Thursday afternoon in October of 2023, with everything that mattered, loaded into the bed of a Ford Ranger. Poppy was asleep in the passenger seat. One small hand curled against the door, a paperback about soil chemistry open on her lap. Silas hadn't woken her when they crossed into Wallowa County. He hadn't looked back at Portland either. There was nothing behind him he needed to see again. The farm had belonged to Elena's uncle, a quiet man named Ansel, who had run cattle up the ridge for 31 years and left the property to his only niece when his heart gave out in the winter of 2020. She had never wanted to sell it. She had also, in the end, never come back to see it. So it sat. The fence posts leaning slow, the pump house rusting into the hillside, the barn roof holding on out of stubbornness, and then Elena was gone too, and the deed passed to a husband who drove east on a Thursday, with an 8-year-old asleep in the front seat and no plan beyond getting through the first frost. Silas fixed the roof first, then the north fencing where the elk had walked through in the spring, then the water line, which had split somewhere below the barn and required 4 days of digging by hand. He did not hire anyone. The work took most of the winter, and he was grateful for that. Grateful for the cold. Grateful for the ache in his shoulders at the end of each day. Grateful for the fact that Joseph was a town where people nodded at the post office instead of asking questions. August Ashbridge had moved onto the adjacent parcel 14 months before Silas arrived. He was 71, recently retired, and had bought the ranch because he wanted mornings the way mornings used to be without a skyline in the way. He had built something once, something with his name on it, and now he wanted to watch light move across the Wallowa peaks and let the rest go. He had not expected a neighbor. Their first meeting happened because one of August's 2 Angus cows found a gap in the fence on a Wednesday afternoon and wandered down to the water trough behind Silas's barn. Silas walked the animal back without saying much. August said thank you. That was the extent of it. The following Friday, August showed up at the fence with 2 enamel mugs of coffee. Silas accepted one without comment. They stood there for about 20 minutes, watching light shift across the ridge. August left when the coffee was gone. He came back the next Friday, and the one after that. By March, it had become a ritual neither of them had named. August brought the coffee. Silas was always already at the fence. They didn't talk about what they'd done before, who they'd been, where they were going. August had noticed early on that Silas never volunteered explanations for anything, not for the quality of his fencing, not for the precision of his drainage work, not for the way he read a topographic map, the way other men read a newspaper. August recognized the kind of quiet. He had worn it himself, once, in the years when he was becoming someone different than he had been. He didn't ask. He waited. Marlo came out once a month, usually on a Saturday. She drove up from Portland in a black Range Rover, stayed 2 nights, helped her father with whatever the land had done to itself in her absence, and drove back on Sunday afternoon. She was 38, and she ran a company with 19 locations and 440 employees, and she managed all of it with a precision that left very little room for the unexpected. She had seen the man next door before she was formally told he existed. 3rd or 4th visit standing at her father's kitchen window while the coffee brewed, watching someone reset fence posts along the dry creek. Methodical, unhurried, not the pace of someone paid by the hour. Her father mentioned him only in passing. Then, one evening in early autumn, August looked out toward the fence line and said something quiet that Marlo heard right and simply didn't understand. She went to bed thinking about it. In the morning, she drove next door. She had a reason she'd rehearsed on the way over. Ashbridge Grange owned a 3.8-acre parcel on the other side of August's line, acquired in 2019 as part of a larger reorganization adjacent to Silas's property along an old irrigation ditch. There were easement questions that had never been formally resolved. Access rights, fence line maintenance on the eastern edge. She was a chief executive. These were operational matters. It made sense to address them directly. That was what she told herself. Silas was on the porch when she came up the drive. He went inside, returned with 2 folding chairs and a wide plank of pine, and set it up as a table without being asked. Then he went back inside again and came out with a tube of rolled maps. He spread the topographic survey across the plank and weighted the corners with stones from his coat pocket. "The easement runs along this line," he said, tracing it with a blunt finger. "Original filing was 1983. It's been referenced in every subsequent transfer here, here, and here." He indicated 3 points without hesitation. "Maintenance responsibility splits at the 3rd post from the north marker. Your company's side, your company's obligation." Marlowe looked at the map. Then she looked at him. "You pulled the filing history. I looked it up." "That's not a county assessor search," she said. "That's a title chain." He didn't answer. "You'd need a paid account. You'd need to know which database." He picked up one of the corner stones and turned it over in his hand. "Some things you don't forget." Her phone buzzed on the plank between them. She glanced at it. Odile Wren, General Counsel, calling from Portland. She picked up. "I'm in Joseph," Marlowe said. "Can I call you back in 10? There was a pause on the other end. Not long. Half a breath. Then, "Joseph." "Of course. Whenever you're ready." She hung up. She didn't notice the pause. She didn't notice the way Odile's tone had flattened for that half second, the way a person's voice goes flat when they recognize something they weren't expecting. Across the plank, Silas was gathering the maps. He rolled them with the same efficiency he'd unrolled them, secured them with a rubber band, and handed her the annotated copy he'd made on a separate sheet. Boundary highlighted, easement flagged, maintenance split marked with a small penciled arrow. She took it. She read it. There was nothing on the page that required a face-to-face meeting to communicate. He kept his eyes on the maps. "Your father asked me in April," he said. She stood a moment. She did not know what to do with the sentence. She carried the annotated survey to her car. She sat with it in her lap for a long time before she started the engine. Portland, Tuesday morning. The board meeting ran 40 minutes long. Bram Halstead presented the Cattell and Vane offer with clean slides and conservative projections. $280 million. Cattell and Vane taking controlling interest after 18 months. Marlowe retained as chief executive for no less than 3 years in what the deck called an ambassadorial capacity. The language around that last part was careful. Bram had chosen the words the way a man chooses the ground he plans to fight on. Marlowe didn't say yes. She said she needed more time. After the room cleared, Odile appeared at her elbow in the corridor, unhurried. "There's something you should read before you form a position," she said. "Article 9 of the Founding Charter. The provision your father put in during the first fiscal year." "I know what's in the charter." Odile looked at her for a moment, read it again, then she walked away. Marlowe spent that evening in her office with Article 9 on the screen, the Community Beneficiary Clause. The language was dense and very specific. Any acquisition materially altering the terms of Ashbridge Grange's regional supplier contracts required a 75% supermajority of the board, not a simple majority. 75%. She read it 3 times. She wasn't sure she understood all of it. She wasn't sure Bram didn't. While she read, across the river in a rented office park in Salem, an investigator opened a file on Silas Marin. Bram had ordered the search on Monday. What came back was a gap. The name appeared in Oregon records going back to birth. Then, after 2022, almost nothing. No professional association memberships, no conference appearances, no published commentary, no former colleagues who tagged him anywhere public. A property deed for the Joseph farm, a truck registration, a library card in Wallowa County. Bram read the report twice. When a man that age had that kind of professional void, it meant one of 2 things. He had failed spectacularly and retreated, or he had succeeded spectacularly and disappeared on purpose. The first type was harmless. The second type was not. Bram authorized a deeper pull. He billed it to the discretionary account he had managed without board oversight for 6 years. By Wednesday night, the second report was on his desk. The gap was cleaner than the first pass had suggested. Whoever Silas Marin had been before 2022, someone had gone to considerable trouble to remove him from public reach. Bram put the report in a drawer and locked the drawer. Marlowe, meanwhile, was still reading. Somewhere in the fifth paragraph of Article 9 she stopped, backed up and read the same clause a fourth time. It described the trigger conditions for the supermajority requirement. It described them so carefully that she began, slowly, to understand what she was looking at. Her father had built the clause the way a man builds a firebreak. He had built it hoping he would never need it. She looked at the clock. 11:42. She thought about the fence in Joseph, about a title chain no farmer would know how to pull, about a voice on a phone going flat for half a second at the sound of a town name. She thought about the 4 words Silas had said on the porch and had not explained. Your father asked me in April. She did not sleep well. She drove back to Joseph on Friday. The excuse was thin. She wanted to confirm a boundary notation on the annotated survey he'd given her. It was not a strong reason. She didn't examine it closely. Silas was on the north fence when she pulled in the section that ran along the dry creek bed where the posts had been sinking on the soft bank for years. She parked and walked out to him. She was in shoes that were wrong for the terrain. He didn't comment on that. They went along the fence line together. He pointed out where the creek bed had shifted 16 inches east over the past decade. Taking a thin strip of soil with it and undercutting 3 posts, he'd already staked the new line. He would reset the posts before the ground froze. Most people only see what's flowering, he said, crouching to press his thumb into the soft earth near a post base. They miss what's moving underneath. She wasn't sure whether he was talking about the fence. They walked another 50 yards without speaking. A jay called from the tree line and went quiet again. The Wallowa Peak stood clean and blue-white against the morning, so close you could count the couloirs where the snow had drifted. She asked about his wife without planning to. The question came out while she was looking at the mountains rather than at him, which was probably why she let herself ask it. He didn't break stride. She made everything look easy, he said, including leaving. He said it the way a person states a fact about weather. It had happened. It was part of the landscape now. Marlowe didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the silence he offered instead. They were almost back at the truck when the kitchen door of the farmhouse opened, and a child came out carrying a plate covered by a linen towel. She was 8 years old, and she moved with the deliberate calm of a child who had learned early to read a room before entering it. She saw Marlowe and stopped, assessed her for a full 3 seconds without expression, then continued to her father and held out the plate. Honeycrisp, she said. I cut 2. Silas took 1 wedge from the plate. He looked at Marlowe with a brief, level expression that was, if she was reading it correctly, an offer. She took the other. The child nodded once, as if confirming an experiment, and went back inside. Silas ate his apple slowly. Marlowe ate hers standing next to a fence post, and for one moment she wasn't the chief executive of anything. She was a woman holding a piece of fruit a stranger's child had thought to include her in. Poppy, Silas said, when the door had closed. She likes to know where new people fit. And where do I fit? That's her question to answer, not mine. She drove back to August's place at dusk. She didn't turn onto his drive right away. She sat in the car at the head of the road with the engine off, looking at the last kitchen light in Silas's farmhouse. It went out at 9:17. She had eaten the apple. She had not meant to stay so long. She did not start the engine for several minutes after the light went off. She could not have explained, if asked, what she was waiting for. Somewhere behind her, a coyote answered another one across the valley, and the sound carried a very long way in the cold. August called her into his study that night, which he only did when something was on his mind. He sat in the leather chair by the window, the one he'd brought east from the Portland office he'd shut down in 2015. She sat on the ottoman across from him, which was the only place to sit that faced him directly. You've been over to Silas's twice, he said. There were easement questions. He looked at her the way he used to look at legal briefs. Patient, waiting for the argument to find its own weakness. I've been watching that man for almost a year, he said. You know what I have never once heard him do? Explain himself. Not once. He fixed that entire barn roof without saying a word about where he learned it. He does arithmetic in his head that other men need 3 software packages for, and he has never once said back when I used to or in my old life or any of the phrases people use when they want a little credit for what they've given up. He settled back in the chair. I left law when I was 35, he said. Walked away from a partner track in Portland to open the first Ashbridge storefront in Corvallis with $18,000 and no guarantee of anything. Your mother stood in that parking lot with me and did not ask a single question. She just said, What do you need me to carry? Marlowe had heard the story before, though usually with less specificity. I recognized something in him, August said simply. The way a man looks when he has chosen correctly. So you sent me over there. I let you find a reason to go. Which is different. He did not tell her what he had asked Silas in April. She noticed the omission and let it stand. Back in her room, she picked up her phone and opened a new message to Silas. She had his number now, a practical artifact of a practical exchange. She typed, "Are you free for coffee sometime this week?" Deleted it, typed, "Coffee Saturday?" Sent it before she could think about it again. His reply came 15 minutes later. Terminal gravity. 9 o'clock. I'll be the one with dirty boots. No question mark. No request for explanation. Just the information. And the small dry note at the end that was the closest he had come to a joke. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. She lay in the dark for a while, thinking about the fact that she had just texted a man without knowing what she wanted from the conversation. It had been a long time since that had happened. She was not sure it had ever happened. Not quite like this. Saturday morning, Terminal Gravity Cafe was half full. Silas was already there. Corner table. Window facing Main Street. Work boots that were, as promised, not clean. 2 cups of black coffee on the table he had ordered without knowing what she drank. And he had been right. And he did not mention that. They talked for over an hour. About the agricultural engineering textbook Poppy had been chewing through. About how Joseph went silent in December when the summer people left and the town went back to being itself. About August's 3 failed batches of goat cheese. Marlowe laughed twice. Both times it surprised her. Then Silas asked, without preamble, "What keeps you up at night about your work?" She had been asked versions of the question in board meetings, investor calls, the intake forms for executive retreats she'd found mostly useless. She had a practiced answer, careful, calibrated, true about nothing. She didn't give it. "Someone is trying to sell what my father built," she said, "and call it growth." He didn't nod along. He didn't reframe it. He didn't offer a perspective. He just reached for the carafe and refilled her cup. That was all. And somehow it was enough. Outside the window, a dog crossed Main Street and disappeared between 2 parked trucks. She drove back to Portland with both hands on the wheel and did not turn on the radio once. The second investigator's report arrived in Bram's inbox on Monday and contained the same absence as the first. The gap wasn't the result of failure. It was the result of design. That was Bram's read. He was not usually wrong about such things. He had his attorney draft a memo for the full board arguing that the community beneficiary clause was legally dormant, that Oregon statute established a 20-year activation window, and a provision unreferenced in board minutes since 2003 had effectively lapsed. The memo cited 3 cases. The lead citation was Willamette Foods versus North Shore Holdings, decided by the Oregon Court of Appeals in 2014. The reasoning was clean. The memo was persuasive on its face. Bram circulated it the day before Marlowe was scheduled to review the charter with outside counsel. That same weekend, before 6 on a Saturday morning, Silas Marin drove 2 hours west to Portland for the first time in 4 years. He parked 2 blocks from the Ashbridge Grange headquarters on Southwest 3rd, went in through the main entrance, left a manila envelope with the front desk attendant, addressed to the office of the chief executive. Inside was a 2-page analysis he had written by hand the night before. The Article 9 language broken down section by section. Bram's memo addressed point by point, and, at the bottom of the second page, a single case citation with a full docket number, Willamette Foods versus North Shore Holdings, vacated on rehearing en banc, 2019. The vacatur was buried. It sat under a different docket number. You had to know to look for it. There was no signature, only a handwritten note at the top of the first page. The clause does not expire. Ask Bram what year he joined the board. He drove back to Joseph. He did not call. He did not wait. Marlowe read the envelope's contents at her desk at 8:45 on Monday morning. She read them twice. Between the 2 pages, a third sheet had slipped free, a small folded rectangle, clearly not meant to be included. She unfolded it. It was a torn corner of legal pad paper. In one corner, faint but unmistakable, the watermark of a private firm. Kestrel Bridge Partners. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the watermark for a long moment. Kestrel Bridge was one of the 2 Portland private equity houses whose names appeared, in cross-reference, in Cattell and Vane's most recent quarterly filings. A co-investor, not the lead, but present in the fund structure, in a way the deck Bram had presented last week had not disclosed. At 9:02, Odile Wren walked in with a folder and closed the door behind her. She set a single document on the desk, minutes from the executive leadership off-site, she said. March 2020, Section 5. Signed by 3 of the men who were about to onboard Bram Halstead onto the board. Marlowe read it. Section 5 was a recommendation that the incoming chief executive not be briefed on Article 9, as the clause was, in the language of the memo, a legacy artifact of the Marin-era drafting cycle likely to complicate the transition without substantive protective benefit. Man. The name was in the document, in her company's own file, written by Bram 6 years ago. Marlowe set the paper down very slowly. Bram and Silas, Kestrel Bridge, the same building, the same era. Bram had known who Silas was, had known him by name, before Silas ever bought the farm in Joseph, and Bram had used the name in an internal memo to argue that Article 9 ought to be quietly shelved. She stood up. She walked to the window. Below her, on 3rd Avenue, taxis moved through a rain that hadn't quite committed to falling. She confirmed one more thing before lunch. Bram had joined the Ashbridge Grange board in 2020, 14 months after her father, in a routine annual filing, had quietly extended and reaffirmed the language of Article 9 without entering the extension into board minutes, because it was a protection her father had hoped he would never need, because he had understood even then that the men who would try to remove it would need to be looking for it. Marlowe closed Article 9 on her screen. She opened her calendar. She cleared her Monday afternoon. She had a conversation to have with the chief operating officer of her father's company, and she did not intend to have it in a room with witnesses. She walked into Bram's office at 4 o'clock. She did not bring notes. Bram was on a call. He waved her to a chair. She did not sit. He ended the call. Marlowe, you knew about Article 9 when you joined the board, she said. And you knew Silas Marin. He rearranged nothing in his face. Whatever training he had been given for moments like this had been thorough. The memo from counsel addresses Article 9, he said. The clause is legally dormant. Willamette Foods was vacated on bank. 2019. Your citation is dead. Half a beat. Very brief. She watched him decide what to try next. You've been driving to Wallowa County to take advice from a man who repairs fences, he said. Is that how we're making board decisions now? No, she said. We're making them based on a document your own counsel misrepresented to this board. He did not answer. There's an internal recommendation from March of 2020, she said. Section 5. Your signature. 2 co-signers. Your language was, and I want to be accurate, a legacy artifact of the Marin-era drafting cycle. You named him. You named him 6 years ago. Bram's hand moved very slightly on the desk blotter. It was the first involuntary movement she had seen him make in 3 years. Marlowe, don't, she said. Not to me. She left the office. She walked past her own without stopping. She took the stairs. At 6:30 she got into her car and drove east. She did not stop for gas. She did not put on the radio. 3¼ hours, the sky went from orange to violet to something that no longer had a name for its color. When she turned onto the gravel road that ran past Silas's fence, the only lights in the valley were the stars and the single lamp on his porch. He was on the porch steps, not waiting, not reading, just sitting in the dark the way a man sits when the day has been long enough that the quiet outside matches the quiet inside. She parked. She walked past the fence without looking for the gate. She crossed the yard and stopped in front of him. Who are you? He was still for a moment. The lamp above him hummed faintly. Someone who read the same kind of paperwork 12 years ago, he said, and didn't catch it in time. He told her then. Not everything. Not all at once. Enough. Kestrel Bridge Partners. Structuring partner. A leveraged roll-up in the Oregon timber industry in 2019 that he had designed the debt architecture for. When the acquired firm collapsed a year later, 400 workers had gone home for the last time, and the founder's oldest son, who had run the mill floor since he was 19, had walked into a stand of Douglas fir with a rifle 2 weeks after the auction. Silas had known the numbers didn't work. He had not pushed hard enough on the people who had told him they did. Elena, his wife, had been a forensic accountant at a firm 3 blocks from his. She had watched what happened at the mill from the outside, and then, quietly, from the inside, had begun assembling a record of Kestrel Bridge's actual role in the structure. She had gotten as far as preparing a filing to the state regulator when she was moved, on paper, to a different practice group. 3 months after the transfer, she had chartered a small plane back from a client meeting in Boise. The weather had come in faster than the forecast. She had been an hour from home. He did not draw a line between those things. He did not need to. The line was there. I left Portland because I did not want to keep being the man who saw it clearly and let it happen, he said. I had already been that man once. Marlo said nothing for a long time. She sat down on the bottom step. Not close. Just there. Above them, the sky over the Wallowas was the kind of dark you only got this far from a city. The stars did not thin. They kept going. Neither of them spoke again for what might have been an hour. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday. Marlo presented the March 2020 document first. She read Section 5 aloud, unhurried, without commentary. Then she set the paper in the center of the table and let it stay there. The room was quiet. 2 of the 3 co-signers asked to speak with their attorneys before continuing. The third, a woman named Vera Eichmann, who had been on the board since 2017, slid her board credentials across the table without speaking and left the room. The other 2 submitted their resignations by end of business the same day. That left 7 voting members. The motion to reject the Cattle and Vein acquisition was raised by Francis Alcott, the board's longest-serving independent member. Appointed by August in the company's 3rd year, the vote was 7-2. Bram's 2 remaining allies were the holdouts. They were outvoted, and everyone in the room understood, at once, that their position on the board had become untenable. Bram was suspended from the chief operating officer role, pending an independent audit. The auditors would have full access to the discretionary account he had managed. Without formal oversight for 6 years, they would have access to everything. That evening, Marlo drove to her house in the West Hills, sat on the front step in her coat, and called her father. She told him how the vote had gone, the document, Odile, the Oregon case that had come apart under Bram's own citation. August listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. I knew Odile would find the right moment. You knew about the document? I knew she'd been watching. She's been watching for 11 years. A pause. Are you all right? I think so. Good. Come out this weekend. She sat on the step after she hung up and looked at the streetlight and did not go inside for a while. She thought about Vera Eichmann pushing the credentials across the polished table. She thought about the way Bram's hand had moved on the blotter, the first small tell she had seen from him in 3 years. She thought about the fact that her father had built a firebreak in 2001 and hoped for 2 decades that no fire would come. Mostly she thought about the porch step in Joseph and about a man who had told her the truth in the dark and had not asked her, afterward, to do anything with it. She thought about the fact that her father had known who Silas Marin was and had not told her, and had let her cross a fence line and find out for herself. She called him back. Dad. Yes. When did you know? About Silas. 3rd month, August said. There was no hesitation. He had been ready for the question for months. Old colleague of mine in Portland called to ask if I knew a man named Marin. Said he'd heard it through 3 mutual contacts. Why didn't you tell me? When I started going over, he was quiet a long time. It was not a hesitation. It was a considered answer. Because you would have seen the resume instead of the man, he said. You would have done research. You would have formed a position before you had a single real conversation. She thought about the first time she had seen Silas at the fence and how she had categorized him instantly. Laborer, rural, uncomplicated, and how every subsequent visit had been a quiet process of revising that categorization. You were right. He didn't say I know. He just made the small sound in the back of his throat he used to make when she was very young and had figured something out on her own. Then he said, "Drive safe." Odile came in on Thursday morning with a piece of paper and set it on Marlo's desk. Not a memo, not a report, a real estate transfer document. Silas Marin had purchased the 3.8-acre Ashbridge Grange parcel, the one adjacent to August's property, the one with the unresolved easement questions. He had offered market rate. He had not negotiated. The transfer had completed the previous afternoon. Marlo looked at the document for a moment. Then she looked up at Odile. Odile picked up her coffee and walked back to her own office without comment. Marlowe drove out to Joseph on Wednesday of the following week. Not a Saturday. A Wednesday afternoon. She had cleared the day deliberately. For the first time in nearly 2 years, cleared it without filling it with something else. She had a board call in the morning and a stretch of open highway after. She found her father in the side yard, not quite gardening, more standing among what was left of the fall growth before the hard freeze came. He had a cup of tea. He offered her one. She accepted. They sat on the low stone wall, the one that had, when she was a teenager, been the boundary between his plans for the yard and the yard's plans for itself. She asked him what he had asked Silas the previous April, the question she had carried across a state line in 3 months. August took a slow breath. I asked him whether there would come a day when you needed to know what he knew, he said. About the industry. About what Bram was preparing. He turned the teacup in his hands. He said, if she finds it herself, then yes. If she doesn't, then no. She watched the light move across the far ridge. She did not answer immediately. She wasn't upset. She was doing the arithmetic of it, the way a person does when a picture becomes clearer than expected. He waited, she said. He waited. For me to walk into it, for you to walk into it as yourself. Not as the person the file would have told you to be. She thought about that for a while. Then she got up and walked across to Silas's property. He was at the eastern corner of the farm, planting bare root fruit stock for the following season. 3 young trees, spaced in the methodical grit of a man making plans that extended past the current calendar year. He looked up when she crossed the fence. He didn't stop working. She watched him for a minute. Then she asked what she had been wondering since the night on the porch. Why didn't you ever use what you knew? You understood what Bram was doing before I did. You could have told me straight. He pressed a root ball into the soil, tamped the air out of it with his palm. Poppy doesn't need a father who's important, he said. She needs one who's present. He kept working. The light was going lower and more golden across the valley. A red-tailed hawk crossed the open air above the eastern ridge and disappeared behind the tree line. Somewhere behind the house, a screen door opened and closed. Poppy, going in for the book she had been reading before it got too cold on the porch. Marlowe stood at the edge of the young orchard with her hands in her coat pockets and did not say anything for a long time. 3 months passed. The civil case moved into its early stages. The audit into Bram's discretionary account produced a first set of findings that were referred to the Oregon Department of Justice. The whole affair became, as those things do, something lawyers would work on for years. Marlowe stopped reading about it closely. She had done what needed doing. The rest was process. Ashbridge Grange had its first quarter under new leadership. The top-line numbers held. Underneath them, something the numbers had never quite measured, shifted the way regional teams communicated at the store level, the reduced friction in areas where Bram's style had produced quiet damage without anyone naming it. Odile was good at the interim chief operating officer role in the way people are good at things they have been informally doing for years. August's health steadied through the winter. He walked more. He eventually solved the goat cheese with help from a woman in town who had been making it for 30 years, and he left a round on Silas's porch without a note. Poppy started spending Wednesday afternoons in August's study, where he had topographic maps of the Wallowas going back to the 1940s. He taught her to read contour lines. She taught him to identify the grasses along his south fence. Both were learning faster than they admitted. Marlowe came to Joseph more often now, and with less planning. Sometimes midweek, she and Silas did not arrange their time formally. She would arrive and he would be doing something, and she would help or watch or sit nearby, and the hours passed without accounting for themselves. Late March. Friday. The sun was still an hour above the western ridge when she turned onto the gravel road. She parked at the fence. She walked out to the old boundary line, the fence between what had been 2 properties and was now something slightly different. Silas was there. She didn't know whether he had heard the car or whether he had been there already. He was looking out at the valley, the Wallowas pale amber in the lowering light, shadow pooling in the dry creek bed below. She stood next to him. They were quiet. Behind them, at some distance, Poppy came out of the farmhouse with a book under her arm and headed toward August's house at the easy trot of a child going somewhere familiar. She did not look back. Farther still, August appeared on his porch. He sat down. He looked out at the 2 people standing at the fence line. He did not get up. The light went lower. The mountains held their color for a while, then softened. No one said anything that needed to be said. There was nothing to announce, no declaration to make, no moment that required a name. There were just two people standing at a fence they no longer had to negotiate over. The fence stayed where it was. Everything else had already moved.